Welcome to the Long COVID podcast with me, Jackie Baxter. I am really excited to bring you today's episode. Please do check out the links in the show notes where you can find the podcast website, social media and support group, as well as a link to buy me a coffee if you are able. You should not rely on any medical information contained in this podcast and related materials in making medical, health-related or other decisions. Please do consult a doctor or other health professional. I love to hear from you. If you've got any suggestions or feedback or just want to say hey, then please do get in touch. I really hope you enjoy this episode, so here we go. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Long COVID podcast. I am delighted to be joined today by Dr. Lydia Knutson, who is a doctor of chiropractic. And we're going to dive into what that means in just a moment. But Lydia, a very warm welcome to the podcast today. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you so much. As Jackie said, I'm a doctor of chiropractic. I'm a teacher, a writer, a researcher, and I've been in practice for a while, for 23 years and counting. No plans for retirement at this point. My clinic, called Lydia Chiropractic, is in Cambridge, Massachusetts, just a mile from Harvard University, on the other side of the river from Boston, for those of you who know the northeast of the United States. Lydia Chiropractic is a multi-doctor practice. And, the geographical location lends itself to an extremely educated patient base who ask us really good questions, and they're always challenging us to do new things. So that keeps things lively, and many new ideas float to the surface of, how to treat people, how to take on new problems as they arise, new health problems. Over the last few decades, I've developed a new chiropractic technique called Axial Stability Method, which is a bit of a mouthful, but in short, it's ASM. It's a combination of established low-force chiropractic techniques put together in a synergistic way. And what really sets us apart, besides the completely low-force approach, is that we make extensive use of Eastern energy medicine. So we work with the acupuncture meridian and chakra nadi systems. Because we really work with all of these systems, the approach is deeply holistic and flexible, really flexible. So with a wide enough scope that in the summer of 2020, I figured out how to adapt it into a long COVID protocol. It took everything I knew to figure that out. As you know, long COVID is a formidable opponent. But in the last 4 years, we've treated well over 150 people with long COVID and or long vax. We approach those two conditions pretty similarly because spike protein is a spike protein. And nearly everyone has experienced meaningful improvement. And many have made quite dramatic recoveries.
That's amazing. And we're going to dive a whole load into what you've actually been doing in a moment, I think, which I'm very excited to hear. Before we sort of go down that rabbit hole, can you say a little bit more about what is chiropractic?
I figured you were going to ask that question. So I did a little research. I decided to go to the National Institute of Health website, which is our government health website. And I found the most amazing, astonishing statement, which was amazing. They said, chiropractic is a licensed healthcare profession that emphasizes the body's ability to heal itself. Could not have said that better. And it goes on. Of the adults who use chiropractic care, 85% use it for pain management. So when most people think of chiropractic or a chiropractor, they think of us as low back pain specialists. And we certainly treat a lot of pain and a lot of back pain and lots of other kind of pain. But chiropractic is also great for a really wide range of health issues because we work with a lot of different systems. We work with the autonomic nervous system, the ANS, which many of your wonderful previous guests on this podcast have talked a lot about the ANS, but just as a little tiny refresher for anybody who hasn't heard those wonderful podcasts, the ANS is a part of the nervous system that regulates automatic functions in the body. So things like heart rate, respiration, sweating, digestion, reproduction, and hundreds of other things. So we work with that. All chiropractic works with that. And we also work with the immune system. The immune system and the ANS are really two key systems in what we think of as long COVID. But as the website says, in everything we do as doctors, we work with the underlying assumption that if you give the body a nudge in the right direction, it can heal itself. And I have a great example of that. A couple of weeks ago, we had an 11-month-old baby come in with unrelenting ear infections after months and months of off and on antibiotics. And they just simply weren't working. The mom said she had a follow-up appointment scheduled with the pediatrician in a week. Things hadn't improved. They were planning on emergency ear tube surgery. So we had 1 week to turn this thing around, no pressure or anything. So she came in for 3 visits and went back to the pediatrician, and the doctor found no infection, no fluid at all, and no sign of previous infection. And she said, whoever did this works miracles. And yes, it was miraculous that this seemingly untreatable condition cleared up in just a week after months and months. And yes, we knew how to help. But the miracle in this is the baby's immune system. The baby's immune system is the miracle worker. We did not treat the ear infection. We supported the baby's immune system to do what it does best. So how does this relate to long COVID? Okay, well, I told you that we have a patient base that pushes us to try new things and won't take no for an answer sometimes. So in the late fall, I think, of 2020, long COVID patient number 1 came through the door. So she was a law student. I think she was late 30s, not old, not young. And she had been super sick in December of 2019. And she was literally out flat in bed for weeks and weeks and weeks. So here we are, late summer of 2020, and she got better, but never really got better. She's got crushing fatigue, and brain fog. So she's having trouble keeping up with classes, which are now, of course, on Zoom. And this crushing fatigue, she can't even walk up a flight of stairs. So that's pretty much curtains for someone in law school. So she comes in and she goes, I've been doing some reading, and I think I have what they're calling, well, at that point it was long haulers, long COVID symptoms, long COVID syndrome. And she said, I think I have that. Do you think you could help me? And I said, I don't know. I think we have a shot at it because of, for decades, we've been working with the immune system and with my orientation that the body heals itself. Let's give it a go. So she kept coming. And she also said, if you can't figure it out, I'm just going to keep coming until you do. So I saw her about maybe 8 times. And the 7th or 8th time, she comes bursting through the door. She had run up 2 flights of stairs. And she said, I'm all better. So I thought, my goodness, okay, is this a one-off, or can I repeat this with other people who have long COVID? So over the next while, we saw a bunch more people with long COVID, and it became pretty clear that we were making a difference for these people. I want to say something about holistic medicine at this point. The level of intervention, just like with the infant and the ear infections, our level of intervention has far fewer contraindications. We have a very low possibility of harm. So therefore, we don't need to wait years and years for research to tell us what long COVID is, or wait for expensive tests and diagnostics for verification of disease. We can just give it a go. And if what we do works, then we know we figured out a way to support the immune system that it works. And if it doesn't work, then we adapt and we try something else. So this is true for any patient that comes through the door. And this, I think it's really important to keep this in mind when we're thinking about these complex chronic illnesses, because the lower the possibility of harm, the more freedom there is for the practitioner to try things. And in this trying and in this experimentation, we might actually stumble upon something that really, really works. So anyway, after that, I thought, oh my God, is it possible that I really figured out this thing that nobody else, it was a real head scratcher. So I thought, what do I need to do? So I called up my colleague, Dr. Stephanie Sullivan, who is the director of chiropractic research at Life University near Atlanta, Georgia. And I said, Stephanie, help. What do we do? And she said, well, we have to do research. So we drew up an IRB, we wrote up a study design, and we've done 2 small studies so far. And our patient-reported outcomes are eye-popping. Eye-popping and really exciting. It's preliminary research. It's the first step to prepare to do a larger controlled trial, which will give us more information about efficacy. But I want to tell you a little bit about our research. So the data that we collected was mostly through symptom surveys, so patient-reported outcomes. Plus, we did some physiological data collection, mostly heart rate variability, as an indicator of ANS dysfunction. We had a total of 13 patients and 2 pilots, but these people were really sick. 6 of them were out of work entirely or working part-time. A bunch of them were part of the alpha wave, and we know how sick those people were. We tracked 40 symptoms. So at that point, there was research was showing that there were these are all the symptoms associated with long COVID. And so we decided to take the top 40 hits and we tracked those 40 symptoms. Between these 13 subjects, they reported a total of 171 symptoms. That is an enormous number of symptoms. These people, some of the other guests on your podcast have talked about, when you sit in front of a doctor and you say, I have these, 21 things, these symptoms, and I think I'm crazy, or they think I'm crazy. So 171 symptoms among 13 people. And that is other than fatigue, because everyone had fatigue. We decided since everyone had that, we would measure it separately, and we used 2 different specific fatigue surveys for that. So what were some of the top symptoms from the list of 40 that our 13 subjects reported? They reported back and joint pain, muscle aches, headaches, dizziness, vision problems. Many of them couldn't look at screens, couldn't do work, brain fog, post-exertional malaise, shortness of breath, heart problems, tachycardia, bradycardia. They couldn't regulate their heart. Loss or distortion of taste and smell, anxiety, sadness. Most of these people were deeply anxious or sad. Was it for the loss of their life? I'm sure. But, did this have something to do with long COVID? We would find out. Heat flashes, night sweats, and it goes on and on. I want to say something about these heat flashes because it's not like menopausal, hot flashes. I had a 32-year-old man as part of the study who was sweating so badly at night that he would soak towels in ice water and drape himself in these towels for as long as 4 hours before he was able to get his temperature regulation down to a point where he could actually get to sleep. So these are severe symptoms. So of the 171 symptoms, 67 of them, the subjects rated as severe. So certainly that young man would have. So severe meaning that on a 10-point scale, they rated the symptom as a 5 to a 10. We decided to crunch the data and look at, because honestly, it's really the severe symptoms that people really care about. A little forgetfulness or whatever, but out and out brain fog, So we looked at these severe symptoms and we crunched the data again. We looked at the data in a bunch of different ways, but this was super interesting. So let me talk about the fatigue. One of the surveys that we used was normed to the United States population. In other words, we know how tired the average American is. So, how does this group compare to that? So, as a cohort, the 13 people started at 80%, the 80th percentile. They're pretty darn tired. By the end of an average of 18 visits, they were down to the 32nd percentile, meaning as a group, they were less tired than the average American at the end of the study. And some of these people, they started out with bone crushing fatigue. So that's the fatigue. So, what happened to these 67 severe symptoms? Also, in an average of 18 visits, there was a 90% reduction in the severity of these symptoms.
That's a really impressive number.
All of them.
We'll be right back. I'm interrupting myself for a second to tell you about long COVID breathing. The fabulous Vicky Jones and I have teamed up to bring you long COVID breathing. We are both passionate about sharing our expertise and experience of the breath and how incredibly helpful that can be with long COVID. We've worked together to develop a course that is specifically tailored to those with long COVID. It's a 6-week course with 12 sessions, all delivered online. The community feel and learning that we're all sharing is such a joy. To find out more information and to sign up for our courses, workshops and other shorter sessions, please check out the link below, longcovidbreathing.com, or email longcovidbreathing@gmail.com to start your breathing journey with us.
It wasn't like we got rid of the back pain, but they still were sweating, or the respiratory symptoms improved, but they were still anxious. No, it was all of them. And these are vastly different kinds of symptoms. So they seemed to be yoked. These symptoms seem to be somehow related to each other, even though the presentation and the symptomatology is very, very different, because they all dropped together. And these were people, some of whom had been sick for as long as 2 years. So, this suggests we are not treating the surface symptom. The expression of whatever the problem is, we are not treating. But we're working somewhere nearer the source of the problem, beyond that particular symptom. And my best explanation is that we are rebalancing the autonomic nervous system and its relationship to the internal organs like the heart and lung, the immune system, the hormonal system, and the sensory motor system. I want to say something about the sensory motor system, because you might say, what? What are you doing with that? How does that, what is that with long COVID? So, for example, I had a patient recently, really pretty bad long COVID and long vax. And she said she couldn't walk. First of all, she had excruciating back pain, so she couldn't sit or walk or stand. But she couldn't walk without holding on to her husband because she couldn't process the visual information. She could only look straight forward. She couldn't turn to the right or left and look at the houses, for instance. So she couldn't process the visual information. And she also said she felt like her legs were mush. She was concerned that she could collapse at any time. So that is the sensory motor system. Anyway, the good news about this wonderful woman is that after a series of visits, she went to her niece's wedding and danced all night in heels, which she was terrified she wouldn't be able to wear heels because she had been wearing sneakers for 3 years before she ended up in our office. And she actually managed to ditch the sneakers and wear fancy shoes.
That's awesome. And I think you've really hit on something here, because all of these things are so connected. Your nervous system is totally connected to your immune system. One isn't working, the other's not going to be working either. You support one, it's going to help support the other. So all these processes in the body are connected. It's like this kind of holistic broadband approach, not necessarily treating individual symptoms. So we're not sort of, right, what can we do for the fatigue? We're going to fix the fatigue, and then we're going to go and fix the brain fog, and then we're going to look at the pain.
it's more this, yeah, holistic approach where we're kind of looking at how can we support the body to support itself. Because I think, when you were saying earlier, when I said, well, what is chiropractic? And you were talking about how, the body can heal itself. We have to put it into that environment where it is able to, and that's physically, emotionally, environmentally, there's all these different aspects. And I think doing one isn't quite enough. And that's the sense of what I get that you're kind of working with. It's that, yeah, you're not hitting on individual symptoms. You're really looking at the whole person.
Absolutely. When you look at 13 people and they have 171 symptoms, there is no way, well, I guess there is a way, figure out which ones are the worst and start kind of whack-a-mole approach, trying to treat the individual symptom. But well, that's not my approach, first of all. And second of all, it's not going to be effective. I mean, you just can't, it's whack-a-mole. You hit one and another one pops up. And I think that this orientation towards the body healing itself, well, I find it the most interesting. And I think it's the most likely way to get people well. I want to say something about biological systems and this whole business of self-healing. So biological systems, they are self-healing. And they are more complex and amazing than we can ever understand. The minute we say we think we understand something, research will show us 5 years later we were all wrong, or that actually we missed this or whatever. So if we just from the outset acknowledge that this biological system is so complex and amazing, I actually can't even, I understand some things about it, but there is a higher level of organization that probably I don't understand yet. But what's interesting about these living systems, a living system, whether it's a forest or a large ecosystem like the ocean or a human body, is that this living system is always trying to maintain itself according to its blueprint. I mean, look at the 11-month-old baby with the ear infection. We just removed the impediment to her system, and then her immune system just zoomed into action and cleared out the infection. So this kind of self-organization within biological systems, it is not so with non-living systems. So what does that mean? So let's take something like, okay, you're in the UK. Let's take the White Cliffs of Dover. So when a chunk of chalk falls into the sea, you don't see that chunk of chalk reorganizing itself and trying to climb back up the cliff. But if you knock a tree over, it will do everything it can to recover and return to its life as a tree. Its tree-ness is built into a blueprint for tree. And this is unique to living systems. So when I approach a patient, the question I humbly ask is not what is wrong or what disease do they have, but what is in the way of this intelligent system getting back to its blueprint, to its fully functioning, vibrant self, like what happened to that baby in a week. So COVID-19, as I said, it is a formidable foe. It's a new virus. I mean, not so new anymore, but in the scheme of things, it's new. So our immune systems have never seen it, but our immune systems are smart. Many, many people get COVID and completely recover, even quickly recover. And some people end up with long COVID. So what is the breakdown within their intelligent system that's keeping them from recovering? So in the treatment room, we ask, in what way is this particular person's system stuck and out of balance? So how do we do that? Some of it is what you might expect in any doctor's office, but we take a lot more time. First, we have them fill out an intake in advance, especially with long COVID, because usually their journeys have been very complex and we're not the first place they're going. So we ask them to detail their illness, who they've seen, what treatments, what's been helpful. And honestly, people have done so many things, some of them mainstream, some of them so wacky, I had never even heard of them. And I research them. I want to understand these people's journey. Like, what have they done? And if anything has been helpful, I really want to know about that. And then we do a very long intake, usually about 3 hours. And we ask about past injuries, so physical, mental, emotional, spiritual, illnesses, all the way back to childhood, and life events that might give us some information about particular vulnerabilities in this person's healing system. Why are they not getting back to their blueprint? Um, Many people suffering from long COVID, when you dig deep enough, have some history of chronic illness. Like they say, oh, I got mono in college and I was sick for a year. Or I was treated for Lyme when I was in my 30s and I thought I got better, but I'm feeling really limey these days. Or I used to have fibromyalgia. That pops up a bunch. I used to have fibromyalgia, but I got all better, but this is sure feeling like that. So there's history there. You need to ask. It takes time. People forget about all the things that have happened. Some people's lives have been very long by the time they get to us. We see people in their 20s and 30s, but we also see people in their 50s and 60s. So we also do a thorough musculoskeletal and neurological physical exam. We look for neurological deficits or weaknesses, in their nervous system. And we also take a really hard look at the muscular system. I mean, we're chiropractors, so, you can think of us as biomechanics. We do extensive orthopedic muscle tests. We have them stand on one leg, tandem gait, things like this. And what we often find is old musculoskeletal injuries will start popping up. And we think they contribute to the dysregulation of the other systems, like the ANS and the immune systems. So, we are chiropractors, and I think what's a little bit unique, especially with Axial Stability Method and what we do in our office, is that we assess everything. That's why it takes so long. We really assess everything because we have to see how far has this system shifted off its blueprint. Regarding musculoskeletal injury, lots of long COVID complaints are actually neuromusculoskeletal. And I don't mean just headaches, back and joint pain, but dizziness, sensory overwhelm. Everything is too fast, too loud, too bright. I got to go lie in a dark room, and recover. A lot of rest is needed, and then the rest isn't restorative. And they have vision problems. Many long COVID sufferers can't look at screens. They can't read. They can't whatever. The vision problems. Well, that's sensory motor, and they have often poor movement. I had a new patient last week who had a really pretty marked movement disorder. In her intake, she wrote that she had chronic Lyme and medically diagnosed COVID vaccine injury. So her symptoms were fatigue, pretty bad fatigue, extreme anxiety, where her heart rate would just go jumping out of her chest in the most inopportune settings, and a movement disorder that looked a lot like Parkinson's. It was pretty noticeable. And it all started after her COVID booster in the fall of 2021. In the last 3 years, she has seen 55 different doctors and practitioners on 3 different continents. She keeps a list. And, I think I'm number 56, and spent untold amounts of money. And after all of this, she really wasn't much better. And she said that, one of the most painful parts of this journey has been having doctors, when she says, I have a medically diagnosed COVID vaccine injury and chronic Lyme, that the doctors just glaze over and she can see them starting to retreat. Or they listen a bit and then they say they can't help her. Well, at least that's honest and that's good. Acknowledge what know your scope of practice and what you are able to do. Or worse, and this was the most painful of all, is that tell her it's all in her head. And I think this kind of medical trauma of not being listened to 3 years into it is one of the greatest harms, actually. And so for us to sit and listen and really listen until the person has said what they need to say, and then we keep asking more questions, is definitely part of the healing process.
I think we can't underestimate how important it is that people feel heard, especially given that so many of them will have been through some of these more traumatic experiences where they have been dismissed. So actually someone who will sit down and say, okay, tell me about it. I will listen to you and then let's see what we can do. I think that is such a valuable thing. And I think, people working in sort of medical spaces, I think, can't underestimate that.
The listening is just the beginning.
Yeah, yeah. It's like the least you should be doing, isn't it?
It's the least you should be doing. So, but we have to find out what are all of the stressors and injuries and insults to this system that may be underlying why they can't heal themselves from long COVID. When I have a patient in front of me, I am thinking about where their ability to heal themselves has broken down. There's actually a useful analogy, I think it's useful, of the rain barrel. Our bodies deal with stressors really, really well. I mean, we do. We're a self-healing organism, right? So we deal with stressors really well. We compensate, we adapt, and we bounce back from a lot of things. But with every stressor or compensation, right? A compensation is a less efficient solution to a problem. And any of those things that hasn't brought us completely back to that original blueprint, it decreases our resilience. Resiliency is what allows you to bounce back from things. So if we think about the water level in a rain barrel, it is as the kind of the level of stressors. As we go through life, the rain barrel, I mean, it's rising. The water is rising, right? I mean, we're getting older. So, but we may not actually be aware of any of these symptoms, but then something suddenly happens. It might be something seemingly really minor, and the water overflows, and suddenly it becomes into our consciousness like, ooh, I have headaches, or my back hurts, or I'm getting sick all the time. Wonder why. COVID-19 is not a minor thing. It's an 800-pound gorilla. It cannonballs into our rain barrel. And if your water level is low enough and your resilience high enough, maybe you can ride it out and bounce back. But if your rain barrel is close to full, then you can have a massive flood. And when that rain barrel overflows, we get a recurrence of old illnesses or an amplification of pre-existing stressors and injuries. Like, I used to have fibromyalgia, it went away, and now I have it back. But it's like a water balloon giving way at its weakest point. That weakest point is different for everyone depending upon their unique, constellation of compensations and stressors, which is why long COVID has a million different symptoms, because it depends upon each person's individual water balloon or rain barrel and where it's given way. So for that new patient last week, it comes to light that she had a bad case of mono in her early 20s and a terrible case of chickenpox at age 25. She also, as it turns out in the case history, she had chronic Lyme disease, and she actually was being actively treated for anaplasmosis. In the fall of 2021, she was finishing up a course of antibiotics, which of course we know sometimes you need antibiotics, but it really does a number on the system. And she had just finished. She hadn't really recovered from that. She hadn't rehabbed her gut after the antibiotics. And then she gets the COVID booster. So a lot of weak places in her water balloon just gave way.
I find this really interesting because, I had a similar experience. My water barrel was too full, as it turns out, when I got my COVID infection, and the water barrel just kind of imploded. And, I think a lot of other people will have kind of had a similar experience. They didn't realize their water barrel was full, but it turned out that it was. But there are also quite a lot of people, and this comes into where you said, looking at the history, because some people don't realize until you really dig into it. But you do get quite a few people saying, but no, I mean, I went back through my history and there wasn't anything, my water barrel wasn't full. Why did this still happen to me? Have you got a theory on that? Is it just that you haven't looked hard enough and there was stuff there?
We'll be right back. Hey there, I'm just jumping in for a second to see if you're enjoying this episode. If you're finding it useful, maybe you would consider sharing it somewhere, a friend, a group, or even on your Twitter feed. If everyone was able to share just once, we'd be able to get this information out to even more people who really, really need it. So please consider sharing somewhere if you possibly can. I hope you enjoy the episode, and thank you so much.
Yeah, I know that there are some people who say, absolutely out of the blue, I had no pre-existing conditions. I was an athlete, 32 years old, blah, blah, blah. And they end up with long COVID. Yes, those people exist, and I think they are in the minority. I think that long COVID really does hit the people who are already down. And the 32-year-olds who come in with long COVID, we actually treat them exactly the same way as the 55-year-old woman with, 25 symptoms. Because I think what our treatments are doing, I mean, I can't say what our treatments are doing. We haven't done that research. But I think fundamentally we are dealing with an imbalance of the autonomic nervous system. So dysautonomia, which many people on this podcast have talked about. Chiropractic is particularly well suited to rebalancing the ANS. We work with it all the time. And the vast array of symptoms that are long COVID identified are really all ANS related. The autonomic nervous system has two basic divisions. There's the parasympathetic division, which is the rest, digest, feed, breathe, versus the sympathetic division, which is fight, flight, freeze. This is not an on-off system. I like to think of it as like a water tap. So you want a little bit of hot, a little bit of cold. The body is constantly adjusting the water temperature in response to the demands of the changing environment. So if you get too much hot water, like let's take the Parkinsonian movement disorder new patient from last week and her anxiety. She says whenever she goes into a doctor's office, her anxiety goes through the roof and her heart starts beating like crazy because her system goes into something sort of a PTSD with her experiences in doctor's offices of not getting the help she needs. And so she goes into this fight-flight mode. Is that really an appropriate response to that environment? She's not under threat. She's not about to die. She doesn't have to run away from the saber-toothed tiger, but her system goes into this intense sympathetic dominance experience. Now, don't get me wrong. These are survival systems. So that sympathetic dominance is super necessary in many survival situations. I mean, you step out into the curb, you see a bus coming at you, your heart rate in an instant goes boom, you send blood to your legs, and you jump back from the curb. Thank God we have these systems. But an over activation of the sympathetic nervous system, particularly with long COVID sufferers, first of all, it's exhausting And then you get stuck in this sympathetic dominance. And I know there's some wonderful people doing great work with, EMDR and cold plunges and breathing. And I know, Jackie, you do wonderful work with this. And that is a fantastic approach. What we have found with our research and what our long COVID protocol is it is actually not a practice. It's not something that you need to do every day to retrain your system. It's actually treatment, right? It's treatment. So you come in for a certain number of visits and we bring the symptom severity down 90%. So what are we actually doing here? First, we say that you've seen one long COVID patient, you've seen one long COVID patient, because the way they have strayed from their own personal blueprint is different in every case. But what I discovered initially with the lawyer was that there seems to be a hierarchy of systems and a sequence in which every body wants to restore order to those systems. This is a way in which all bodies are similar in spite of all the differences, and that our treatment approach is very upstream from these symptoms. So what is this protocol? I'll skip a lot of the chiropractic details. I've created actually a 6-day course for chiropractors to learn this protocol. But let me talk about this for a lay person. The first thing we do that seems to be this systems approach for everybody is the first thing we do is we work with the parasympathetic division. So we are really focusing on the ANS out of the gate. So the vagus nerve, which is the primary parasympathetic innervation, is a cranial nerve. It comes out of the head, down the neck, and into the thorax and the abdomen, and it innervates almost all of the internal organs. So with all of these sensory motor difficulties that long COVID sufferers experience, so the fatigue, the vision problems, the dizziness, the sense of disequilibrium, that things are too fast, too loud, too whatever, that is really a sensory integration issue. So we work with the sensory motor system of the upper cervical spine, which is where the vagus nerve exits. I'm assuming this is what we're doing because of the results that we're getting, is that we free up or stimulate or somehow support that parasympathetic division to get back to business. We basically kind of pump up support or the cool water into the balancing of the hot and cold water, and it starts to calm the system down. Then we go on and we work with the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. The way we work with this is actually very structural. One of your guests said that the sympathetic nervous system is like a string of pearls that go up and down the spine. So, well, you think of chiropractors and we're kind of spine specialists, so it seems like we should know something about this. And in fact, the levels of the spine correspond, we call them spinal concordances. They correspond with these specific string of pearls. So different thoracic levels of the spine associate with the different organ systems. These concordances have been talked about for 2,000 years in the acupuncture system. They were talked about in the 19th century with osteopathic doctors. And all the way through the 20th century, various chiropractic approaches have also come up with ways of dealing with this. So, for instance, the third thoracic level is associated with the lungs and respiration. The first thoracic level and the second thoracic level are associated with heart. Thoracic level 7 is involved with the spleen, which is very important for the immune system, and on and on. So we have a way of working very specifically with these different thoracic levels and their innervations, sympathetic innervations of the organ systems, and we seem to tonify the system. So you don't want to disable or somehow tamp down the sympathetic system. We need it. But what we do is we tonify it. And tonifying means that we give it degrees of freedom so that it can go up and it can go down and not be just stuck in hot water all the time. So maybe it sounds a little bit like, I don't know, how do you possibly do this? And in fact, patients will say, how is this possible? I mean, we do absolutely low force treatments. So there's no spinal manipulations. It's gentle sequence of touching of the thoracic spine. And patients will say they can't believe something that gentle could possibly make such a difference. But we're really stimulating, freeing up, or pumping up the parasympathetic division, and we are tonifying the sympathetic division. And then, like the infant with her ear infection, the body goes, oh, I can do this. And it fixes itself, which is how we can get, in 18 visits, a 90% reduction in severe symptoms.
I think one of the things that I didn't get at the start. I mean, I didn't understand anything at the start, which I think, is very common, but also kind of understanding how, you need all the parts of your nervous system. If you didn't have your fight flight response, then actually that would be really bad. But it's having a nervous system that is balanced, that's resilient, that's able to move in and out of all of these states when appropriate. So I think this is what's so wonderful about bringing the body back into balance, however you do it. And you've developed this protocol that seems to be having really amazing results and is leading you into doing all this fantastic research to kind of learn more about it, I suppose. But yeah, it's that idea of balancing the body, because the body is designed to work.
So that rebalancing the autonomic nervous system that we do in our protocol, that rebalancing, which in our research there was a 70% decrease in severe symptoms after this first series, and it was about 8 visits. So we have 3 phases of care, and if you have a look at our research, there are 3 phases of care, and that first phase of care, the improvement was a 70% decrease in all severe symptoms, which, I mean, that's jaw-dropping. And how is this possible? But I think it really underscores what a big player in long COVID and other post-viral syndromes the ANS plays. And all the way through this, we've been talking about long COVID. I don't really like the word long COVID. I mean, it's fine. It's a post-viral syndrome, and we happen to know the agent of infection. But I think we can think about this in a much larger umbrella. And I like that the COVID community is now starting to, group these syndromes under the larger umbrella of infection-associated chronic illnesses, because we know through the biomedical research, which is fantastic what they're figuring out, that COVID-19 reinvigorates latent herpes viruses. And we have absolutely found that to be true, because with the more kind of recalcitrant or, slower to recover long COVID people, we really have to then use this same approach with the immune system and the autonomic nervous system. We have to use this approach, but instead of focusing on SARS-CoV-2 as the agent, look at EBV or CMV or herpes 1, herpes 2, and Lyme, because these are these chronic illnesses that affect the energy systems. And I think that whenever somebody has as a primary complaint fatigue, MECSF, chronic fatigue syndrome, fatigue, we have to think, what is happening with that autonomic nervous system? So somehow these viral infections have destabilized the ANS. And I think that when that ANS gets stabilized, its incredible influence over the immune system is causing that the immune system to not get back to business. Now, you could argue the other way, which is to say, well, maybe the disruption in the immune system has in fact disrupted the ANS. And I actually think that's true. I think that it's a chicken and egg type situation. So you can't just do you can do autonomic nervous system kind of practices to get that back in balance, but I think that that is much more time consuming than actually going after it in a treatment modality where you actually are treating and allowing the body to reorganize itself through several different systems, the immune system and the autonomic nervous system. And that this is true for all of these umbrella IACIs. Regarding, like what we do in our office and treatments, we have had people come and we just do the first series of 8 to 10 treatments, that first kind of rebalancing of the ANS, because they've come from out of town for long distances or whatever, and we just do that. Usually they feel better enough after that they're like, well, I want more. And so they either come back or they stay longer, for a couple of months or something. I'll take as an example the woman who had to hang on to her husband when she went for a walk and couldn't turn left or right. In working with her, first, of course, we work with that sensory motor system of the upper cervical spine, normalizing processing of sensory data, and she had a lot of improvement. But our second and third phases of care include a more conventional chiropractic approach in which we actually start working with the biomechanical system more specifically, and that kind of jelly in her legs and feeling like they'll just, fall out from under her. It really wasn't until we moved into the second and third phases of care where we actually really work with all of those old neuromusculoskeletal injuries that she was able to dance at her niece's wedding in high heels.
Or high heels being the important bit.
For her, yes.
But you know what? Joking aside, everyone has their things that are important to them. For some people, it might be being able to care for their children, or for being able to exercise, or being able to wear high heels at a wedding, and you can't tell someone what's important to them. That's got to come from them, hasn't it? So it sounds really cool, this idea of working with the body. I love that. And I think that's very empowering as well. And I think, when you become ill with something like long COVID, whether it's long COVID itself or a vaccine injury or ME/CFS, either before or after COVID, whatever you want to call it, these conditions, we feel very helpless a lot of the time. And having something that's making you feel like, okay, I'm helping support my body into a position where actually it can function, whether that's by working with yourself or whatever it is that person finds. It's so important to find something that is starting to help.
We always, at the beginning of treatment, when we were doing that 3-hour intake, one of the things that we do is we compile a list of benchmarks, which has to do with their goals. What do they want to be able to do? And sometimes the list is very long and sometimes it's not. But, every visit we update. How is that benchmark? How is that doing? Were you able to read today? Were you able to do this? So it feels very respectful of the person and their goals. And I think that approaching with that level of respect is also part of the humbleness of that's their conscious desires, but it's also approaching with humility this highly intelligent system that actually does know how to heal. It just has lost its way. And I want to say something about research and this idea of level of intervention based on level of harm. I think we need to start asking new questions. And I think we need more research focused on actual treatment. I mean, the biomedical research out there is fantastic. Learning about reservoirs and endothelial damage and all that is super important. But we need to develop new treatment approaches and research the ones that are already showing promise and that have such a low level of possible harm. Like those treatment strategies need to be investigated. They need to show interest. And showing interest means actually funding them. We were able to do our research because grateful patients stepped forward and gave us money. Without that, I would not be on your show saying we had a 90% reduction in severe symptoms in 18 visits. Research is really, really important for understanding the efficacy, which you understand we did no control, so it's not about efficacy. That will be our next research study. But to understand not what it is we're doing necessarily, because that is a different kind of research, but at least doing outcomes research. Did the person improve? And if so, it seems like this is something people should try because the possibility of harm is so low. So I want to give a shout out to my patients who believed in us and gave us the money for research. And there needs to be more of this, and not just my office. And so fantasy of mine would be something like, well, let's go to the chiropractic associations and ask them, hey, could you survey your members and see whether people are coming up with treatments for long COVID? Go to the acupuncture society, go to the manual medicine people, find out, and then actually seek out those treatments that these people are discovering. That is not how research tends to happen in the United States or even worldwide. And I think that faced with this extreme global issue, I think it's time.
Yeah, it's got to be about what we can do. And there's a lot that we can do. Lydia, thank you so much. This has been eye-opening for me. So I'm so excited to hear where your research goes next. I will drop all of your links into the show notes, so anyone who's wanting to find out more or get in touch with you, then they can do that. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you for all that you are doing for this long COVID community.
Thank you so much to all of my guests and to you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least found it useful. The Long COVID podcast is entirely self-produced and self-funded. I'm doing all of this myself. If you're able to, please go to buymeacoffee.com/longcovidpod to help me cover the costs of hosting the podcast. Please look out for the next episode of the Long COVID podcast. It's available on all the usual podcast hosting things. And do get in touch. I'd love to hear from you.